So good evening, welcome everyone. My name is Federica Goffi. I'm the interim director of the Azrieli School of Architecture and Urbanism at Carleton University. Thank you for joining us for the launch of the 2021-2022 Forum Lecture Series. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that our school and the Carleton campus are located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. And I'm excited to be launching the Forum Lecture Series with you, which is titled Reassemble. I also would like to take the opportunity before we start to introduce the curators of the series this year. Dr. Susie Harris-Brands is an assistant professor at our school, and she joined us last year. She holds a PhD in Urban and Regional Studies from MIT and a Master of Architecture from the University of Waterloo. And she's a licensed architect in Ontario. She teaches in our graduate and undergraduate programs. And her research brings together design and the social sciences to explore issues of power, equity, and collective identity in the built environment. I'm also pleased to introduce Associate Professor Ben Gianni, who has taught at the school for many years and has also been a past director. He holds an MArch from Yale University School of Architecture and teaches courses on housing and urban history. He leads the housing studio in the 4th year of the BS program and coordinates the school's urbanism major. So I would like also to acknowledge our funding sponsors and thank our speakers for tonight's lectures. And welcome Susie and Ben, who will now introduce the speakers. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you, Federica. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone to the first lecture in this year's Forum Lecture Series, which we've themed Reassemble. Now, the notion of assembly is at the core of architecture, from building materials to community connections, theoretical frameworks to programmatic uses, structural components, and project teams. It's through these broadly defined yet interconnected assemblies that we construct our built environment. As we navigate new ways of convening and interacting with one another following the easing of lockdowns, this year's Forum Lecture Series turns to these many processes of architectural assembly and reassembly. We can be reminded that the history of architecture is one of perennial reassembly, of building on and iterating theories, of reconfiguring design concepts, approaches, and collaborations, in addition to physically, materially forming our built environment. The many impacts of this past pandemic-focused year have only underscored our impetus to reassemble. Over 6 lectures, our acclaimed speakers, including Carleton alumni and recipients of the Governor General's Award in Architecture, will examine this notion of reassembly. They'll take into consideration larger demographic challenges, economic influences, and climate imperatives, expanding trends both at large and small communities. Speakers will share their intersectional understandings of the challenges facing society and our opportunities for alliances in addressing them. Looking forward, the series asks, how might both ourselves and our surrounding environment reassemble? Now, as Federica mentioned, we'd like to thank this series' founding sponsors for their generous support. So Charles Foote Development, GRC Architects, Hoven Architecture, IBI Group, Merkley Supply, and Trinity Development Group. We further extend a tremendous thanks to all those at our school who have assisted with the series behind the scenes. As you can see here, we have an outstanding lineup for the year ahead, so please mark your calendars for these upcoming events. They'll happen on Monday or Tuesday evenings at 6 p.m. and will require you to register. More information about the Forum Lecture Series, as well as how to register, is available on our website. Some brief logistical notes for this evening. For those of you less familiar with Zoom's webinar format, we'd like to call to your attention some of the different features. So there's no need to mute yourself. That's done automatically. And there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window, which can be used to ask the panel questions. And in line with this, the chat function has been disabled. And now we get to this evening's talk. Over to my colleague Ben Gianni to introduce our lecture for tonight.
Thank you, Susie, and thank you, Federica. And thanks very much to our guests tonight. We've got 3 guests. First up will be Dr. Valerie Preston from York University, followed by Dr. Nick Luca from McGill University, and then a discussion period where we will take the general discussion and focus on Ottawa, for which our guest contributor is Jeff Leeper, a city councillor here in Ottawa. So our lecture this evening focuses on the notion of demographic reassembly and its impact on our cities. Canada relies significantly on immigration for its growth, a process that in turn offers a rich sense of diversity and demographic variance to our communities. As our country advances, culturally and economically through new immigration, large and small communities alike are becoming increasingly diverse and heterogeneous, transforming our previous understandings of national identity and multiculturalism. And this takes place at a time of growing numbers of retirees and migration away from downtown cores of cities. How then has our demographic reassembly influenced urbanization patterns, intensification schemes, and the provision of public amenities? In the face of temporarily reduced immigration numbers and the flight to suburbia driven by COVID-19, what demographic-driven development patterns are emerging across Canada? So tonight, each speaker is invited to respond to the session's theme and prompts through 20-minute visual presentations. And after that, as I mentioned, the panel will switch over to an open discussion joined by our guest, Ottawa City Council Jeff Leeper. This will be followed by an audience Q&A. So rather than introducing all the speakers together, I'm going to introduce them in the order. So I'll introduce Valerie Preston, as she'll be speaking first, and then between her and Nick Luca, I'll introduce Nick. So Dr. Valerie Preston, welcome. Valerie is an urban social geographer, and she studies gendered and racialized inequities in contemporary cities, especially the challenges that immigrants face in urban housing and labor markets. Based at York University, she leads the Building Migrant Resilience in Cities, Immigration et Résilience au milieu urbain, a partnership of academics, researchers, community practitioners, and government policymakers that's investigating a social resilience approach in the inclusion of newcomers in Ontario and Quebec cities. She's also involved in projects examining the impacts of the pandemic on immigrant serving agencies in the two provinces, the economic trajectories of Toronto's diverse second generation, and the impacts of gender differences in commuting on racialized women's access to development. Welcome, Valerie, and over to you.
Okay, just give me a moment, folks, while I find my screen and get it organized. Hang on a minute. Now. I want to thank Ben and Susie for the invitation to speak today. This is a topic very close to my heart. They've given me 20 minutes, so at the 18-minute point, someone's going to have to tell me to be quiet because this is a topic I could talk about for many hours. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I also want to acknowledge that my presentation does not take account or grapple with the growing Indigenous presence in Canadian cities. And the issue of the relations among settlers, immigrants, and Indigenous peoples in Canada's cities really warrants our attention, and I hope it will come up in the discussion because I know Ottawa has a large and growing Indigenous population. And tonight, I also want to begin by acknowledging Canada's settler history. We are a nation founded on the idea of immigration, beginning in the 19th century. We have not always been open to immigrants from around the world. This is the Kamagatu Maru, the ship from India that was turned back after spending many, many days in Vancouver Harbor. But in 2017, on our 150th anniversary, this is how we tried to portray ourselves to the world as Canada, a nation of diversity. So what I'm going to talk about tonight, let me give you the takeaways to begin, is that yes, immigration is transforming Canada's cities. Newcomers and the Canadian born have similar infrastructure needs, although the immigration needs of newcomers vary during integration. COVID-19 has disrupted migration flows, and even more important from my perspective, newcomers' lives. And there are important impacts, therefore, on cities. And finally, I want to make a plea for local planning and policy making rather than provincial, federal, or even metropolitan. So I'm going to do this in 4 pieces. I'm going to talk about the demographic characteristics of newcomers. I am an urban social geographer from my toenails up to the top of my head. So I'm going to talk about the social geographies of newcomers. I want to say something about infrastructure needs, and then I want to talk a little bit about COVID-19. And I want to emphasize it's a little bit. So this is a poster that was in the report to Parliament about the 2019 immigration. And I want to draw your attention to the number, 341,180 people came to Canada as permanent residents in 2019. Permanent residents are people who are landed immigrants. We call them immigrants. And they have many of the social, civic, and legal rights, both native born or Canadian born, as well as naturalized Canadians. However, and they are the claim to fame for Canada as a country of immigration. But I want you to notice another number on this infographic. In 2019, the Canadian government issued more than 400,000 temporary work permits. It also had almost 75,000 people transition from temporary to permanent residence. Who are these people? They are not so much part of this narrative about Canada as a country of immigration, but I want to argue that they are incredibly important to Canadian cities. There are 2 main groups of temporary residents. In 2019, there were over 600,000 international students holding study permits in Canada. And if you look at the graph for temporary foreign workers, the top line is the total. And what you will notice is there's about 300,000 of them. If we add in the people who are also in Canada as refugee claimants, we've got 1 million people living in Canada in 2019 on temporary visas. Who are these people? Well, we know a little bit more about international students than we do temporary foreign workers. As you would expect, international students are prime working age. They're between sort of 20 and 40. They are widely distributed across the country, mostly in urban places because that's where our universities and colleges are located. The majority of them come from Asia. And 2/3 of them want to stay in Canada. In fact, evidence is that they are not as successful as they would like to be. A study that I did with a colleague, Marsha Akbar, shows that between 2005 and 2015, only 38% of international students became permanent residents or immigrants. And finally, they are not eligible for most public services in Canada. They don't get public health care. They don't get childcare subsidies, and they don't get much help with this process of transitioning to become an immigrant. And a study that a colleague has undertaken recently in Kitchener-Waterloo has shown that the lack of public services is a serious problem for growing numbers of international students. One woman had come from Iran. She already had 2 graduate degrees. She had 2 kids, and she did not anticipate the high cost of housing and the high cost of daycare. The consequence was she had no time for her studies and was about to fail her studies and have to leave the country. Temporary foreign workers, on the other hand, are much more likely to be found in small urban centers. They also are from Asia predominantly, although they come from slightly different mix of countries. They're between 25 and 45, slightly older. They have an even lower chance of staying in Canada. About 21% make the transition from temporary to permanent. Unlike international students, they have a range of educational characteristics. Some have already achieved postgraduate education. Others are coming with 1, maybe 2 years of post-secondary education. So these two groups, 1 million people almost, that's about the sum total of what we know about them. But I want you to keep them in the back of your mind, because they are rarely mentioned as part of this story of a country of immigration, and yet they are in our cities, and unlike permanent residents, have a much higher probability of becoming people without status. They are likely to lose their visa status. They have much higher likelihood of losing their visa status than people who arrive as permanent residents. So who are these permanent residents? As you can see from this graph, they've been coming for many years. I want you to notice from 2012 onwards, the number has been increasing. The number declined dramatically in 2020. The government plans to make up the gap in the number of expected immigrants that did not arrive in 2020, in 2021, 22, and 23. So they hope to have more than 400,000 permanent residents arrive in each of those years. It's a lot of people, but spread it across Canada, it's not as many. They do not live across Canada. How do they come? Well, they come in 3 categories. They come as economic class, about 60% a year. These are people admitted to Canada because of their qualifications, because of their experience. They're expected to enhance our economic development. About 25% are sponsored by family members, and the remaining 15% are refugees, people who the United Nations recognizes as having a well-founded fear of persecution and unable to return to their normal country of residence. There has been an enormous change in where these people come from. In Canada, increasingly, immigrants are coming from Asia, Africa, Caribbean, and Latin America. Those now account for more than 2/3 of all immigrants. It was a much smaller proportion in 1971. What has stayed the same during that period is that these are working age immigrants primarily. People my age aren't very welcome in Canada unless our kids sponsor us. Secondly, the average landed immigrant or permanent resident is better educated than the average Canadian of the same age. The vast majority speak English or French, except for refugees. The refugee population is bifurcated between well-educated professionals who often speak English or French. I don't know about you, but I've heard so many Afghan interpreters for the Canadian Army. I'm kind of convinced that Afghanistan consists mostly of people who speak English or French. But the other group of refugees is a group of people who come often lacking advanced literacy skills in their first language. So the refugee population is very bifurcated. Family-sponsored immigrants are a mixed bag. They are more likely than refugees to speak English or French, more likely to be well-educated. It depends on who's sponsoring them. The ability to sponsor depends on having sufficient income. So it tends to be a reasonably well-educated group with reasonable linguistic skills. But what is a concern to me particularly is where are people coming from? The growth in the number of people coming from Asia, the Caribbean, and Africa has meant that Canada's minority population is increasing. As you know, a visible minority is a person who is not of Indigenous background and who does not identify, and here I quote, as white, Caucasian, or of European background. And in 2016, more than 1 in 5 Canadians identified as a minority. And we expect, because of the nature of immigration, that will be more than 1 in 3 by 2036. This is a tremendous change for a country that has been a white settler society. And it is a change that is unevenly distributed across Canada. I want to point out, here it is, here's what I need. There we are. 78% of the population of Toronto is first and second generation immigrant. 70% in Vancouver are first and second generation. By second generation, we mean anyone who has at least one parent who is foreign born. In Canada, first and second generation are only 42% of the population. And for those of you in Ottawa-Gatineau, you're a little bit under the national rate. So immigrants are regionalizing, and there are tremendous efforts to get them to regionalize, but they remain concentrated in Canada's, at least 2 of Canada's historic gateway cities. The regionalization is evident when you see that in Calgary, half the population is first and second generation, and the same is true in Hamilton. Toronto has been transformed. This is a cartoon about dull Toronto. This is the Toronto I first knew on my way to graduate school when I was thrown out of Montreal and had to move to Hamilton. There might be one of my father's ancestors in here, I hate to admit. I haven't looked too closely. On the other hand, this is the current Toronto, a much more interesting place. Many of you will remember that June night when the Raptors won. Here we are. It is a very different place. And that difference is also very spatially variegated. So here's some information about Ontario metropolitan areas. Toronto sits out here all by itself. More than half the population in the metropolitan area identifies as visible minority. And the closest after that is the Ottawa part of the Ottawa-Gatineau metropolitan area, 25%. There just is no place in Ontario that is as much minority, majority, or majority, minority as Toronto. But when we look at Toronto more closely, when we look at Ontario municipalities, the building blocks of metropolitan areas, I want you to notice 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 suburbs. These are municipalities that are in the inner suburbs of Toronto, the outer suburbs of Toronto, areas which had small historic municipalities that have just exploded since 1976. In contrast, places like Waterloo, Windsor, City of Ottawa, much lower levels of visible minority, although still substantial and growing, and expected to grow much more quickly in the future. So minorities are in the suburbs of the gateway cities. If we had a similar graph for British Columbia, it would show the same pattern. Surrey, Burnaby, Richmond, these municipalities have a much larger share of the population who identify as minorities than the city of Vancouver. And then when we look at an even finer scale, and I want to thank my colleague Brian Ray at the University of Ottawa, this is immigrants in the city of Toronto. You only gave me 20 minutes, so I can't show you all my maps, but roughly, this is the city of Toronto. What I want you to notice, the darker the shading, the higher the percentage of the population that is immigrants. Here is Markham. Here is Brampton, here's Mississauga. Those outer suburbs, which have high proportions of minorities, are also the places that have high proportions of immigrants. And if we look within Toronto, here is the northwestern corner. This is an area that includes the neighborhood of Jane Finch. Here is the eastern half, Scarborough. So that the finer grain, what you find is a more and more variegated pattern. What I want you to notice is here's the hole in what would be the donut. This is Yonge Street, which subway runs up. These are the neighborhoods on either side. They include the gentrifying neighborhoods east and west of downtown. They also include the historic elite neighborhoods that lie north of downtown on either side of the subway. The other thing to notice is water counts. Here's the beach. And if you look along the shoreline of Lake Ontario, you'll find that there are many census tracts which have a relatively low proportion of immigrants. So depending on the scale, the more local you become, the more you become aware of the uneven residential distribution of immigrants and the minority populations that are associated with them now. And why is that? There are two factors. First of all, housing. I don't need to tell anybody about the high cost of housing. What we know about immigrants and housing, we don't know much about temporary residents, that's why I'm talking about immigrants, is that they have very varied housing careers. There are affluent immigrants, those economic class immigrants, and they move directly to the suburbs, usually to the outer suburbs, to spacious suburban home ownership. Many immigrants rent in aging high rises in the inner suburbs. A lot of them were built in the 1970s. These are limited dividend buildings. They are getting pretty old at this point. A few people end up in subsidized social housing. Most of that was built again in the 70s and 80s. There is some in central Toronto, but a lot of it is in inner suburbs. And the inner suburbs are Scarborough, that northwestern corner, places that developed between World War II and 1976. Now, over time, many newcomers have been able to become homeowners. But in addition to dealing with affordability, renters also deal with high rates of crowding, and their housing is in poor physical condition in many cases, not all, but in many cases. Many immigrant homeowners experience financial stress. They have trouble paying their mortgage, and that was before COVID-19. And that's because of the persistent and absolutely appalling earning gaps between the first generation and Canadian-born workers, and gaps that persist into the second generation. This is a diagram I've taken from an article by Garnet Picot and Fang Hu. And I want you to notice it shows that the gap in earnings between immigrants and Canadian-born sits at about a little bit more than 15% if you're in science, technology, engineering, or management. It's closer to 25, even 30% for all workers. And if, like me, you're in a non-STEM subject, you're going to have an even bigger earnings gap. It was improving. We don't know what COVID will have done to this. The other thing I want to point out is there is a gap between the second generation and the Canadian-born population, and it is highly racialized. The group of second generation in Toronto that earns the most are the children of immigrants from Northern and Western Europe. They earn between sort of $58,000 and $68,000. Men earn more than women. I will say no more about that. Chinese, second generation, earn almost as much, but people who identify as Black earn much less. They earn between about $47,000 and $49,000, and in this case, women earn more than men. Those persistent earning gaps influence the success of immigrants in the housing market and their ability to hang on to their houses. And they cannot be explained by education, years of experience, gender, age, or any of the other standard measures of human capital. And I will just leave you to think about that. So what does this mean for the second generation? Well, as you can
Valerie,
see, yep.
you had asked for the 18-minute.
Yep.
That we're at about
I'm
20
just
now.
about there. We will just leave the second generation behind. Let me talk about infrastructure. Okay, in terms of infrastructure, I'm going to talk about two kinds: soft infrastructure, hard infrastructure. Settlement services in Canadian cities are largely concentrated in central locations. That's because immigrants used to settle near downtown. As immigrants have moved to the suburbs, settlement services have struggled to keep up with their relocation. This has become a particular issue as in the suburbs, transportation is limited. Immigrants are much more likely to use transit than the Canadian born during the first 10 years in Canada, and that's particularly true for immigrant women. More than half of immigrant women in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver use transit. No other group comes close. What kind of transit do you have in the inner and outer suburbs of big Canadian cities? You have buses that take you to the subway. Crowded buses, slow buses, unreliable buses. The situation is even worse in small cities like Brandon, Russell, Manitoba, where there are only buses, and there are pictures of people standing out in the cold in that Manitoba winter, waiting 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes for the bus. So for newcomers, infrastructure is crucial. Newcomers need settlement services in their first 10 years in Canada. They need them to be accessible, both in terms of scheduling, but also in terms of location. The only way to ensure that is to provide public transportation that's reliable, frequent, and has a dense network. What did COVID-19 do? Well, first and foremost, part of the reason for the wage disparity is that immigrants are concentrated in essential industries. Many of them had a high risk of COVID-19 transmission, even in Ottawa. Ottawa, Gatineau has the lowest share of employment in essential industries of any metropolitan area in Ontario and Quebec. It's about half of all jobs. It's lower than anywhere else in Ontario and Quebec. What happened? Well, if you look at the bottom, here's immigrant women and immigrant men. They were concentrated, or disproportionately, their jobs are found in industries that shut down. Personal services, accommodation, and food services. Even as those industries have reopened, they've reopened with unreliable and reduced hours. They are also overrepresented in manufacturing, where we know there is a high risk of COVID-19 transmission. And finally, immigrant women are disproportionately working in healthcare, where there have also, as we learned this week, been exposures and outbreaks. They also experience a risk of COVID-19 while commuting. Every transit operator in North America has tried to ensure the safety of their drivers and passengers. In Brampton, Ontario, a bus driver died who had worked on the route serving the Amazon warehouse that had several severe outbreaks. People got in his bus, they didn't know they had COVID. He ended up with it and died. So what does this mean? COVID has definitely exacerbated inequalities for newcomers. It has exaggerated spatial inequalities. The buses that are still crowded in Toronto are the buses serving those concentrations of newcomers in the Northwest and the Northeast. We need local responses. There's no point in talking about responding to COVID-19 and its inequality at a metropolitan level. The inequality is experienced at a local level. I put in this quote from a document from the Ontario Local Immigration Partnership because it highlights the agency of newcomers themselves. There are resources in newcomer communities that we need to take advantage of. And I want to suggest we know how to do this. We've learned how to do this through the pandemic. If you want local decision-making, then follow the practices of public health units. They do local information gathering. They knew down to the GIS coordinates where there were outbreaks. Local immigration partnerships already know how to develop and sustain multi-sectoral collaborations that include non-governmental organizations, include public sector organizations, include private sector organizations, and include the government. And finally, local decision-making will only work with sustained funding and mandate. I don't know where you were when the pandemic started. I was in New York City. I watched the Canadian news every night because I was terrified of what was happening in the United States. And gradually I kept seeing more and more fire chiefs. And that's because the fire departments have funding and the mandate to do disaster and emergency management planning. Without that funding and mandate, local decision-making isn't effective. So let me finish there and say thank you. Hopefully, if we did more local decision-making, when we came to make this poster in the year 2067, on our 200th birthday, 20, whatever the year is, never mind, 2067, then we would be able to actually celebrate Canada as a nation of diversity. Thank you. And there's no time for questions now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Preston. As you said, barely getting into it and we're running out of time, but this is a fantastic snapshot of where we were, where we are, and it really helps us to think about where we are going or what we're becoming as a nation. So thank you very much for those. And we will come back during the question period and involve you. So we'll now turn to our second speaker, who is Dr. Nick Luca. Nick has a hybrid background in architecture and planning and cultural geography. As an ethnographer working in urban design and landscape planning, he has specialized for 25 years in questions of housing, cultural landscapes, and urban form. From his base at McGill University in Montreal, he works in close collaboration with state agencies and civil society organizations on co-production through planning and community-based design strategies. He's currently funded projects include a SSHRC or SHIRK partnership grant with colleagues across Canada on institutional reform in housing production to address the affordability challenge, an action-related project also funded by SHIRK on commoning and co-production of public spaces with Montreal's Champs de Possible as case study, and several EU-funded projects with colleagues in Sweden, Germany, and Switzerland and France, and the Low Countries on conjugating densification, policy impulses to transit-oriented development, and context-responsive landscape strategies in post-suburban and peri-urban contexts. So please join me in welcoming Nick, and over to you, Nick.
Thank you so much, Ben, and I hope you can hear me and see my slides well. Great, thank you so much. Real pleasure to be here, so thank you to the organizers for the invitation. And thank you also to Valerie Preston for that excellent and super information-rich and thought-provoking presentation, which really sets up the conversation in an excellent way for me as well, because I'm going to focus more on, I think, the material sorts of interventions that architects in particular are involved with in transforming urban space. But I'm going to talk about it in terms of three preoccupations. And they're not necessarily preoccupations that are good, but things that are going on that we need to be paying attention to. The first one is densification as a phenomenon, but also as something that is to be pursued and to be curated, I would say. And I specifically am going to introduce you, if you haven't encountered this expression before, to a very important way of thinking about densification, which is soft densification, densification douce, or gentle densification, which is a way to weave new housing, job spaces, and other activities into existing fabrics and neighborhoods, etc. The second preoccupation is neo-counter-urbanization, which is a mouthful, as I just demonstrated. But it's another phenomenon that was already well underway when the pandemic hit, and that I'm exploring in detail with my research team and with colleagues in Sweden and other countries, as was mentioned in my introduction. And the third preoccupation, which I think is the biggest one, is meaningful participation. And I think many of the points that Valerie raised are really important and germane in that respect. How do we ensure that our diverse publics in Canada and in our metropolitan areas in particular are given opportunities to participate meaningfully in the conversations and the transformations that are taking place? So I think densification and infrastructural change is something that we're familiar with in architecture, planning, landscape architecture, engineering related fields. If we were in a room, I would ask you to name what this place is for me, and people would shout out Venice, the Grand Canal, or the Rideau Canal, or something like that. And I'd say, no, it's not. It's the Thames Embankment in London, which is a byproduct, in a sense, of another set of vector-borne diseases, of which COVID-19 is one example. And this is actually a public works project. It's basically a deck and a set of decorations for the public good on top of one of the first major modern sewerage systems in a Western city. And that's the kind of thing that is really important to think about in terms of how catastrophes or major events of the sort that we're undergoing right now hopefully force us to rethink the way we deploy collective resources, etc. Densification as a preoccupation is something that we have a sort of colorful relationship with, I would say, in Canada and in the Anglo-American world more broadly. These images on the left and the right in particular, if you see on the left, there's a man holding up a sign with 87 in the foreground. These are actually photographs that were taken as part of what was called at the time a slum clearance project in central Montreal. And it was very much a set of interventions that were typical across North America and many other OECD countries, driven in many ways by a fear of density and legitimate concerns over overcrowding and poor quality housing. And so we've had a kind of a difficult relationship with density because, of course, we've really successfully managed to decant so much of our population into suburban and peri-urban and even into near rural areas. And I'm showing this picture with a sort of a mea culpa. This is a house I had in the Eastern Townships, and that's one of my dogs who really enjoyed living there. I have another one of my dogs behind me, and I'm hoping he's not going to choose a moment while I'm talking to start barking loudly, but it has been known to happen. What I'm really interested in, and this is where densification and neo-counter-urbanization start to sort of weave together like the strands of DNA, double helix sort of phenomenon. There's a lot of counter-urbanization going on, which is the movement of populations away from core metropolitan areas and away from the inner suburbs that Valerie described and presented so much important data on, to the outer suburbs and to the rural urban fringe. And this is often done in pursuit of a kind of a leisure lifestyle or a lifestyle that is somehow associated with slower paces of life, or at least countryside living. But there are also transformations that have significant impacts on the use of land, in the sense that many of the places where these sort of exurban housing interventions take place are some of the best farmland in their respective regions, their respective countries. This happens to be on the north shore of Lake Ontario, somewhere near Cobourg. And this land, basically, that we see, almost all of it that's in the waterfront lots, has been taken out of active agricultural production and is now being used for decorative hobby farm / exurban picturesque uses. So there's some lovely details. If you see here, this little white streak here is actually a fence that they put up to somehow block a view. There's fascinating stuff going on here in terms of micro landscapes of culture. So I've been very interested in this neo-counter-urbanization or counter-urbanization phenomenon for most of my career. And a lot of the work I've done as an ethnographer is working with people who live in these sorts of settings, cottage settings, second home settings, exurban places, and working with them to understand through interviews, in-depth interviews, what it is that motivates them and how they practice space. And if there are opportunities to sort of rethink the way that populations are deploying and reorganizing themselves in the landscape. It goes without saying, I think, that a lot of what happens whenever there's an outbreak of some kind of major disease, pandemics of any sort, there is an exodus from city neighborhoods and areas. And one of the things that we're talking a lot about nowadays is the apparent surge in movement to suburban and exurban or peri-urban locations amongst the populations who can telework, who can do the sorts of things that we're doing tonight. But that is not a lot of people. It's not the people who are the pickers at the Amazon warehouse. It's not the people who are driving the buses, and it's not the frontline healthcare workers or people necessarily in the supermarkets. So it's a very stratified and I would argue very racialized, but we don't yet know enough about to what extent our populations reorganizing themselves, both in terms of where they live, but also in how they occupy dwellings that they may have in more than one location. So what's really interesting as well about this drive to the fringe, which has been steadily underway for most of the last 100 years in Ontario and Quebec in particular, is that it intersects with densification in very interesting ways. And so we get pockets of hyperdensification. And if there's one main argument I want to make through this whole talk, and I'm thinking specifically to the 91 people who are in the room, most of whom I presume are architects or architecture students, I believe that there's an awful lot of work. There's a very important set of mandates for architects in this work of densification, because we cannot densify well without being highly attenuated to form and experiential qualities and the sort of the atmospheres, the micro landscapes that we find in these contexts, because otherwise what we end up with is settings that are unpleasant. Now, I'm not going to make any comment in terms of good or bad on the Interwest project at Mont-Tremblant, but it's an example of new construction that is driven by a kind of amenity, aesthetic, kind of nostalgic, pseudo-European ski village, etc. But at the same time, it's very interesting because what they were striving for and what I think they've achieved here is what we often call in planning circles, the 15-minute city or the 15-minute neighborhood, where people can live without having to drive on a regular basis, to the point that they have to put a sign up saying, remember to slow down as you're skiing down to the bottom of the slope and not crash into the people sitting at the cafe enjoying their $17 lattes. So there's a lot of architectural skill that can be used here, but it's not necessarily used. And I think that's one of the sort of systemic and institutional questions that we need to work on. Neo-counter-urbanization and densification is not necessarily interesting because it is a kind of far-flung suburbanization or spreading out of populations, and that can entail enormous infrastructure costs, both in the hard and soft categories, right? So these waterfront properties here are serviced by a public road, and that road not only needs to be built and maintained, it also has to have its snow removed, and people are going to be coming in and out of it on a daily basis all year round. It's also a place where emergency medical services need to be able to have access, and of course where rubbish and recycling trucks regularly need to shuttle up and down. And it has been known to happen that these sort of linear villages that appear along water bodies end up being unable to sustain themselves without a sewerage system, where each dwelling is on its own septic or holding tank. There's a sort of a tipping point, as Malcolm Gladwell would call it, where there has to be a collective sewerage system installed, and that is usually done at tremendous expense, and that's usually mostly public expense. So at the same time, people are willing to live at high densities, and if density is something that we have a difficult relationship with let's say in Canada, in the Anglo-American world, at least amongst the older generations, the nth generation Canadians. My ancestors came from Scotland to Quebec City sometime in the weeks following the conquest in the mid 18th century. But my father's father was brought to Canada as an indentured laborer from Austro-Hungary. So newer Canadians often come from cultures where there are different sets of ideas and cultural norms around living at higher densities. And just as Valerie mentioned, the use of public transport is often more pronounced and higher amongst first and second generation Canadians, not necessarily because that's the only option they have available to them, what is called in technical language, captive ridership, but because there's not the sort of stigma or status associated with either living at higher densities or using public transport. So what's also really fascinating is that densification and neo-counter-urbanization intersect and bring new typologies into contexts where people are not necessarily comfortable with multi-unit assemblages or where land transformations may not correspond with cultural norms and cultural values, especially when we think about this notion of the picturesque and the countryside ideal. And it's to the point where 20 years ago, this magazine, which has over 1 million readers each issue, published in Toronto, ran a special feature called The Urbanization of the Place We Love. What are we doing to cottage country? Captured in this cartoon on the right-hand side here, the fear that we were wrecking the rural-urban fringe or the cottage landscapes. But of course, the irony is that these sorts of landscapes have always been, in a sense, a leading edge of suburbanization or exurbanization. And so there's a kind of deep contradiction there. But it's something that's fascinating and I think has a great deal of potential and possibility in terms of design and planning and interventions. So there are good reasons that we're afraid of densification. It's very easy to densify in ways that are very bad. The model on the left-hand side, you may have seen, it's from one of the reform hearings in Manhattan in New York City. And it was built to demonstrate the acute problems of crowding, of hyper-densification, where so many rooms and so many households had no access to air. And this might be unpleasant under the best of times, but it becomes deeply problematic when we think about fires, and then it becomes literally quite deadly when there are outbreaks of vector-borne diseases, such as COVID-19. And that exists in both on the real plane, and also on the plane of perception, the worry and the fear that higher densities are ways that people expose themselves to greater risks, etc. So why is densification something that was being talked about in a very particular way? And I know that Ottawa is pursuing a very, shall we say, an assertive strategy right now, which I would applaud in terms of densification. This is The Economist in 2015 running a leader on the high cost of wasting land and the need to densify. And of course, now when we look at this kind of image, we think, oh my goodness gracious, let's just pause for a second. Maybe the artist who was commissioned to do this cover wouldn't be asked to do something that was so vivid and so reminiscent of that Manhattan model. At the same time, and this is just about a year and a half ago, there's now a recognition across many market-led OECD countries, in which Canada, I'd say, is one of the worst offenders, that we have a terrible problem in terms of housing affordability. And what's fascinating for me is that The Economist is a very conservative, pro-laissez-faire kind of newspaper, said, as its subtitle, the obsession with homeownership has been very harmful. The obsession with asking people to own their dwellings and encouraging and creating government incentives and structures and subsidies to encourage that has actually put us into the pickle that we're in. And today's federal election is very much, I would say, about the question of access to housing. And it's not just access to housing in terms of affordability, but also in terms of decent, dignified, and comfortable. So the thing is that our city governments and our regional governments and our provincial governments in Canada are very aggressively pursuing densification with a view to actually capitalizing on infrastructure investments, particularly in terms of higher order public transport, trains, metro lines, the Crosstown LRT, which is just opening in Toronto, the O train that has been in operation in Ottawa, etc. This is an example from Montreal. So we have a metropolitan community. It's not technically a level of government. It doesn't have official powers to make policy, but it can make recommendations and suggest that the independent municipalities and the agglomerations that are made up of several municipalities collaborate and coordinate their efforts. And what we see here with the little dots are zones that are transit-oriented development circles within which there are expected to be minimum density thresholds. And this is very similar to what we've seen in Ontario with the Toronto, Greater Hamilton, Toronto area and the Places to Grow plan that came out in 2013. So there are very important and aggressive thresholds that local municipalities must meet. And I agree completely with Valerie on the point that this is really a question of local decision-making, local conversations, and local capacity building. The conversations, however, are usually kind of ugly because people are not comfortable with change, okay? This organization, this small civil society organization became infamous a few years ago because They lobbied against densification that was taking place in a central, older suburban neighborhood, pre-war suburban neighborhood of Toronto, which they characterized as being threatened by density creep. We must act now against zealous and inappropriate development applications, or our neighborhoods will be changed forever. In a country like Canada, where we both have always had high levels of immigration, and where our economic and cultural liveliness and health relies on steady immigration, I think it's a bit, I don't know how to say it gently, it's a bit absurd to be worried about neighborhood change, unless you really, really, really would like things to stay in stasis, because we are dynamic places, and one of the things that happens in places with population growth of any sort is that densification tends to happen over time. That's not to dismiss the concerns and the narratives of the people who are expressing their hesitations or their frustrations about densification. I love this image. This is from Australia. First of all, you'll notice that the people I've shown are all very, very, very white, pale-eyed, people who look like me. And I love this line. This is actually a quote from this charming looking old couple. It will destroy the rural ambiance of our neighborhood. Don't know about you, but I don't normally associate 8-story elevator, double loaded corridor slab buildings with rural neighborhoods. But people's narratives and representations are very powerful, and people will fight to defend what they see as their home turf, etc. This is not something that's new to the human condition. I do a lot of work in Sweden, and some of you may recognize this image. It's a famous one. Sweden was one of the last countries in Western Europe to switch from left-hand to right-hand drive. And this is on the morning of the first day of driving on the right. And you can just see the confusion, and you can see the bickering, and you can see the amusement, and imagine the transaction costs. Change is hard. The London Thames embankment that I showed you a slide of only came about when Parliament, the Houses of Parliament, could no longer sit. The House of Commons, the House of Lords could no longer convene because the smell of the Thames River was unbearable because of the raw sewage. Didn't matter that people were dying of cholera left, right, and center. So change is tough, something we have to deal with. Working with this sort of participatory challenge is really exciting, because I think that we can actually work in collaboration with people who have concerns and hesitations. And the onus is upon us to figure out what it is that they are concerned about, and where there are pain thresholds, where there are different kinds of social acceptability for densification. And there are many different ways we can do this. Some people think fondly of the work of artists like Christo and Jean-Claude wrapping the Reichstag here as follies. But in many instances, the reason that they did this work was because they wanted people to have conversations and to realize that maybe it's not such a ridiculous and awful thing to wrap a parliament building in fabric, because it actually says something very powerful. I believe similarly that we can do similar and fun and interesting things. And that's a lot of the work I've been doing with many colleagues and civil society organizations in Montreal, where we have a rich history of participation and participatory decision-making, if only because we're pushing back against top-down sorts of government interventions. This is from the Milton Park affair, which led to the establishment of Canada's first and largest distributed co-op, housing co-op in the 1970s. Here's the rub, and this is one of the things that I really want to rub in, no pun intended. Densification is mandated by state policy. Densification can be done badly, and densification produces frustrating results. So how is it that we can actually improve the process and the product? I think we have to go a bit further than these visual representations, which were produced by the Ministry of Municipal Affairs in Ontario as examples of how we can densify. Isn't that wonderful? That's the before and after, and I don't find that particularly inspiring, nor does it actually make a lot of sense when you think about the kind of public realm that's created there. And so again, this is where I think that there's a really important set of roles that architects need to play, because architects have the specific kinds of skills around weaving form and void and porosity into denser configurations. So the argument that I've made, and I'm not the first one to make it, but I'm just going to keep barking it until it starts to resonate, is that it doesn't really matter how dense we make it, but how we make it dense. And I'm not going to present you with the empirical evidence here, but I'm going to give you the argument, and I'm going to share with you the claim that a lot of empirical evidence on perceptions and experiences of satisfaction with density and densification have revealed that there's no quantitative relationship, there's no causal relationship between density, number of units, number of jobs per hectare, per square kilometer increasing, and frustration and sadness and unhappiness, etc. We can very easily manipulate visual and experiential qualities in space to actually make higher densities feel very comfortable. And indeed, some of our most sought after neighborhoods are incredibly dense. Many people who come to Montreal to do their studies in architecture and urban planning sort of get all somewhat starry-eyed and excited about neighborhoods like the Plateau, where we have some of the highest densities in North America, 150 people per hectare, which is 10 times the average density in a metro suburb in a place like Toronto or Ottawa, or for that matter, the rest of Montreal. So this is a set of arguments that I've been making, and I would invite you to have a look at that. I think I should be wrapping up, I'm probably past my 20-minute threshold, and you're being very kind and very polite not to ask me to slow down. But this is a graphic that many of you will have seen in some way or another. Same density expressed in different morphologies. It's architects who can figure out how to do these sorts of things. We also have plenty of examples of how we can actually make soft densification work, and also ideas around how we can distribute activity and built form in space in ways that also conjugate well with biodiversity, landscape connectivity, and other imperatives which have to do with the resilience, let's say, in hydrological and other terms. The problem, and I think this is where I will end, is that we can also fall into these traps of abstracting space and thinking about the work of densification as just a matter of drawing a bunch of circles on a two-dimensional Cartesian map. I pair these two images because it's as though they hired the same graphic designer, or they just said, send over the InDesign files and I'll just drop those layers onto this map of Skåne. This is the southernmost province of Sweden. And each one of the circles represents a train station in which there is supposed to be high and aggressive densification. And the problem that I think comes with transit-oriented development and densification is that it doesn't challenge the basic sort of fact of high levels of mobility. And that's something that COVID has taught us is probably quite, it's very elastic, the assumption that people will travel quite a bit. I'm not forgetting the rural-urban fringe. I will say in the end, one of the reasons I have this these regional maps is that I think it's actually in the post-suburban, the inner and outer suburban and rural-urban fringe areas where we really need to focus our efforts. And I think I'll just end with citing work by Ellen Dunham Jones, who's an architect based in the US, who's argued for many years about 75%. 75% of new construction is taking place in what we call suburban and peri-urban places. And yet so little of our architecture and planning, education and formal conversation is really focusing on those contexts. So I'm hoping that that will give you something to chew on. And I'm looking forward to our roundtable discussion. Thank you.
Thank you
so much, Nick.
Go for it, Susie. For the introduction, and then we can switch to our roundtable discussion.
Great. So we just need to introduce one more person, who is the person who's coming to join us for our roundtable discussion. And the point of the roundtable discussion is to take some of this larger context that Valerie and Nick have been presenting and kind of apply it, try it out on our local context. So to that end, we've invited Jeff Leeper, who is Ottawa City Council, the Kitchissippi Ward, which is an inner ward, one of the few inner wards in Ottawa. Jeff was first elected in 2014. He was born and raised in Ottawa. He studied history and English at the University of Ottawa, as well as print journalism at Algonquin College. And in addition to being a councillor in the inner city ward, which is Hintonburg, Westboro, is that right, Jeff? Do I get that right?
Hintonburg, Kelly Park, Westboro.
Westboro. which is one of the areas of Ottawa that's seen a lot of intensification recently. Jeff is also on the planning committee in the city of Ottawa, so he's responsible for reviewing reviews of development applications and deciding what should go where and what pace of change and what form that change should take. So welcome, Jeff, to this conversation.
Thank you, Ben.
Susie, back over to you. Or is it over to me?
And we did have, so we can just start maybe, Jeff, with a brief question that can contextualize things a bit for Ottawa. So we heard some great statistics from Valerie about the growth rates, and we're wondering just a bit more about population increases in Ottawa. How much is it expected to grow by 2050? What about the National Capital Region as a whole, if you had any insights on that?
Absolutely, thanks. And thanks, first of all, to Nick and Valerie. Those were fascinating presentations. And I do want to acknowledge that I'm speaking tonight from the never surrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. So that is, to Valerie's point, something that is critical to keep in mind. There are a number of Ottawa City staff here as well this evening, and I want to say hi to them. Particularly Royce Fu, I believe, is here this evening. He does a lot of the statistical work for the city of Ottawa, who was kind enough to answer some of the questions that I know are going to be posed since I was running out of time to research the exact answers. Any mistakes that I make, however, are entirely mine. So Ottawa is growing very quickly. We are a population of a little over 1 million today in the city of Ottawa. And keep in mind, of course, that the larger region includes Gatineau, which is across the river in Quebec. We are expecting to grow by 2046 to a population of about 1.4 million. So 1.45 million by 2050 or so. It's a lot of people, and determining how to accommodate those folks, new neighbors, over the course of the next decades in a way that is environmentally and economically sustainable is actually what we are grappling with right now as we develop our new official plan.
Thanks, Jeff. I suspect that there are several factors at play, but what's driving this growth in Ottawa? Where will the newcomers be coming from, and in what sort of percentages? Is it something like, perhaps we can think about this growth relative to immigrant and refugees, but maybe also people moving from larger cities in search of more affordable housing or a better lifestyle? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I took a quick look at the numbers. The projections for Ottawa are that about 80% of our growth over the course of the next 45 years or so are going to be coming from immigration. Oh, sorry, sorry, it's not net internal growth. 80% will be people who are moving into the city, of which 2/3 of that 80% will be from international immigration. Something like 6% is expected to be refugees and students, and it's a fairly small proportion, I suspect, in compared to many cities. But what we are seeing is a very high number of, I think Valerie would categorize them, or the government would categorize them, as economic immigrants into the city. The big growth, I'm Gen X, and our generation is finding itself absolutely sandwiched between the millennials and the boomers. Those are going to be the big growth areas over the next 45 years or so, or sorry, 25 years or so.
Thanks, Jeff. So Susie and I are going to do a little back and forth, and we do invite Valerie and Nick to jump in at any point. So what impact will the economic and demographic profile of these newcomers have on their housing needs? For instance, there are very different housing needs for young couples versus low to moderate income families with children who need a lot of space and don't have a lot of money, versus empty nesters who like a lot of space and have a lot of money. How do you think this in-migration of people is going to affect housing demand?
Yeah, and this is something that, as Valerie particularly was speaking, I wish we had a better handle on in the city. We tend to take a look at high-level housing needs without getting into discussions about where those folks are coming from. But what I can say demographically is that with a very high number of economic immigrants coming in, Ottawa is experiencing the same kind of, I believe planners call it inversion, as other cities across North America, where our core is gentrifying very quickly. The housing needs that are strongest today, the market demand that is strongest today, is for those suburban single detached homes. The we clearly have a lot of refugees who are coming in as well, and deeply affordable housing is a challenge for us to meet the demand, particularly for families. We have far too many refugee families who are currently in shelter in Ottawa, and housing them in affordable housing, whether it's provided through our not-for-profit partners or through Ottawa Community Housing, which is our state housing agency, that's going to be a real challenge. But what we're seeing is an absolute explosion in our suburbs of the diasporas, particularly from Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and to a certain extent from Africa as well. And this is something I talk to some of our developers about fairly frequently, is the effort in the view of some developers to meet the market demand from immigrants with single family housing, when city councils across North America, I think, are trying to intensify and get away from communities that are wholly single detached homes, is actually being painted in racialized terms, where if we deny economic immigrants the opportunity to buy single detached homes, is that a racist policy? Does it have those implications? Fascinating question. It's not something, however, with which City Council tends to grapple very often, because we don't take a look at where the housing, or who is demanding the housing. All we know is what the housing demand is.
Jeff, thank you. I noticed Valerie would like to chime in, and I think after she makes some comments, Nick would like to chime in as well. So Valerie? And you're muted, Valerie.
The words of 2020. What you're describing, Jeff, is an issue, first of all, regardless of the attention that geographers, urbanists, architects give to gentrification, the fundamental spatial reorganization going on in our cities is still suburbanization. Nick was quite right when he mentioned that. And we overlook it at our peril, given that we want to have more environmentally, sustainable cities. That's the first comment I was going to make. So Ottawa is very typical. The second thing is that this question of who gets to buy single-family detached housing. In Canadian cities where housing costs are increasing much more rapidly than incomes, but where the population growth is increasingly a racialized population, is one that municipalities are going to have to struggle with, because the idea that the municipal government serves an undifferentiated public just doesn't work anymore as the complexion of Canadian cities changes. And so I've done a bunch of interviews with people from Hong Kong, Korea, Iran about homeownership. Their goal is to get into a single family house as big as they can afford, with as much grass as they can afford, in the best school district as soon as possible. And they do not appreciate, and they will move further and further out, and they will learn to drive. And the women hate learning to drive in America in Canadian winters, but they will do it to get that house. So.
Yep. And you're bearing out, I wish we knew this other than anecdotally, but you are bearing out what I am hearing anecdotally. And of course, that presents problems in a city like Ottawa, and I think most municipalities across North America, where we've learned the high cost of urban sprawl, of suburbanization, and the challenge for us is to try to allow for new housing to be built in our suburbs, but in a form that is no longer single detached housing, so that we can serve it economically with transit, so that it can be served, so that the 15-minute neighborhoods that Nick was talking about are not just found in highly gentrified wards like mine, but the infrastructure is not set up today, and the funding mechanisms are not there, and the authorities for cities to try to impose 15-minute, I'm trying to find the right adjective, 15-minute-itude on pre-existing neighborhoods is limited. And it's an absolutely fascinating challenge for my colleagues and I, and for our senior planning staff.
I know Nick wants to jump in, but Jeff, I just want to say, I'm a suburban boy. I grew up in the suburbs in the US outside of Pittsburgh. We were at about quarter acre lots. Suburbs really meant green and leafy. When I go to Barrhaven, I think, oh my God, this does not look like a suburb. It is so dense. You wonder why people even bother. I mean, this is to Nick's point, I think, about it's not the density, it's how you build it, right? Suburbs are sort of built at double, if not higher, the density here than in the US, and yet they still operate as if they were at half the density. You can't walk anywhere. So anyway, over to you, Nick.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and it's another nuance in the density conversation, which I won't bore you with the details, but it points to the importance of distinguishing between net density and gross density. And by that we mean the land that is being used as the denominator for calculating density. And in Ontario and Quebec, and especially in the St. Lawrence lowlands, so basically where 2/3 of the population of Canada lives, we've been building to incredibly high net densities for decades. And they're exactly what you just described, Ben. But they're at very stupidly low gross densities for two reasons. One is that all the roads and other infrastructure that's needed to service all of these residential areas remain large and need to be large because of the reasons that Valerie pointed out. They're not serviceable by public transport. But the other thing is we don't pay enough attention to what Larry Bourne has called non-residential sprawl, which is where the factories and the office campuses, all of these sort of plein-pied, one-level buildings that spread out, and they have enormous surface parking lots, etc. So that's again where we need to get into some of the minutiae of density. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I work with planners and I work with architects. I train both professions, and I find that the planners are a lot less adept at working with the nuances of density. And I think that that's where architects can play a really exciting role. I think the points that have just been made are hugely important. The diverse publics is the most important one. We need to make an enormous amount of progress in terms of engaging diverse publics in different languages. That's something we've always, or at least for the last 40 years, we've tried to work hard on in Montreal. But also different cultural competencies, different sets of ideas, because what happens so often at public meetings is you get university educated, professional people with a lot of disposable income. We don't do enough to reach out to different kinds of backgrounds who have different ways of thinking about issues, space, and so on and so forth. And that brings me to the point about the housing choice, et cetera. I think that what Valerie was just describing, and Jeff, what you were describing in terms of the conversations with the land developers around what do people want if they're first or second generation, a detached house. A detached house, not necessarily because, although that's part of it, that's part, there's a vision or an image of this is what success is. My grandfather built a detached house in the 1930s and sent pictures of it back to his family in the old country to prove that he had been successful. But also because there's a great deal of flexibility in the way that detached house on a single lot can be used and organized. And one of the things that I found really fascinating in the last couple of years is when architecture students are doing their capstone projects and saying, what if we develop different typologies that had flex spaces to allow for home businesses and a small shop or a small hairdresser salon to be opened up in what might otherwise be the garage space. So I think that's where there's some room for experimentation. So it's not the detached house that's necessarily the fascination, although there's a lot of it there. It's the flexibility and the malleability of what you can do with the parcel of land, with the building, et cetera. The last thing I just wanted to mention quickly is that the inner and outer suburbs are where we see an enormous proportion of first and second generation Canadians. But the peri-urban remains terrifyingly old school settler community, white Anglo-Franco. And that's not by coincidence. Okay, one of the biggest problems we have in Quebec right now, of course, is that there's Montreal and then there are the regions. And you go outside Montreal and you're in the regions, and you're in places that are 97% white, 97% francophone de souche, and so on and so forth. And so there are a lot of tensions and comfort thresholds that need to be taken into consideration there. But again, there's also this sort of utility. There's a logic that is at work. There's when you know, I think there's a lot we can work with in terms of ethnography and understanding the sort of the diversity of social and cultural norms that people are bringing to places where they settle. And we can do a lot better work in terms of creating broader and more flexible affordances for transforming and allowing people to transform space in terms of housing and otherwise.
May I ask a question of you both, Valerie and Nick, with respect to what we've seen, particularly during the pandemic? And Nick, I would suggest you probably said it was occurring before this, I'm sorry, neo-counter-urbanism, and the degree to which it is very white, because longer settled populations are unlocking the value in their gentrifying neighborhoods, choosing to escape intensification and moving out. I mean, how much of it is due to some of the probably obscene increases in property value that we've seen in our core neighborhoods that are well served by transit and are 15-minute?
I'll make two comments, Jeff. First, the best data I've seen on this was actually in the New York Times. The part of New York City that emptied out were was the relatively affluent Upper West Side and other affluent neighborhoods on the East Side. The extent to which people have come back, I don't think we know yet. So the move out of the city, so that was one group. The other group, and this is completely anecdotal, I sat in a Lower East Side apartment office in an old industrial building opposite a new high-rise. And the doorman across the street became someone we talked to regularly. And they had a lot of students in there. Those students all left and were not replaced. So that was why rents declined so dramatically in parts of Manhattan. So people at the very beginning of their adult lives also left. And whether or not they'll come back is an open question. So it is white in the United States. It is the upper middle class and the affluent moving to those peri-urban, or what I call ex-urban regions. That leaves the municipality with a real problem. These are the taxpayers. Okay, despite the rhetoric we've heard in the last 6 weeks, there aren't a lot of billionaires and big corporations in Canada. Those of us who are comfortably middle class are the major sources of taxes. Taxes need to be progressive. Most of us can live with progressive income taxes. Somebody starts proposing to tax the wealth in my house, that's a whole other issue. People assume they're going to keep that nest egg. So for municipalities, those people leaving is a real issue. The other point that I'd make is Nick is right. What we're really talking about is the land use regulation issue. Larry Bourne years ago pointed out that if you look at a density map of Toronto, it is absolutely flat. Density is the same. It doesn't matter until you hit that urban-rural fringe, it doesn't change. But the separation of land uses that you get starting in the post-war period on a large scale is what is promoting all this need to move around. And that's something municipalities do control.
Yep. And I know we in Ottawa we've taken tentative steps toward it under our previous official plan with the introduction of more flexible zoning in residential areas to allow for, we began with ensuring that the grandfathered pizza shop would forever be able to remain a pizza shop should it wish, the corner stores, etc. But I will say there has been a real pushback toward integrating uses in our most affluent neighborhoods. Our most affluent neighborhoods oppose in very strong terms the introduction of non-residential uses. It's a very political problem. Our new official plan in draft form is starting to try to pull apart those very strictly separated land uses, but it remains a big question as to whether or not the voters will approve of that.
And you're not going to get a lot of support, I don't think, from that growing group of voters who are successful, upper middle class, well-educated immigrants working in Ottawa's high tech, who are the people who support you need to get that change made. Yeah, and I don't know a solution, because the appeal of North America for many of these people, from the research I've done, is a single family detached house with a green lawn in a green neighborhood.
Where change is highly controlled. The whole promise of suburbia is to escape to a place where you can control what's going on around you. The idea that that suburbia itself is changing and transforming is quite threatening. Nick, did you want to wade in too?
I think I agree with what's being said. I think the neo counter urbanization, and I should also just sort of give a salute to Michael Nugent, one of my grads who's in the room. We together came up with that term over a couple of drinks many moons ago. But he's my project manager. We're doing some very detailed empirical work on trying to understand demand and sensitive pain thresholds. And social acceptability. And Jeff, what you've just described, I think, is pretty consistent with what I found both directly and through other work. I think that one of the things we should be keeping in mind with COVID and the changes in counter urbanization, and I'm going to use my anecdote from New York City, is that a lot of the people who are either cashing in on and moving out to the rural urban fringe are also, and I've seen this happen quite a bit, and there's good evidence of this, are also doing the pied-à-terre in the city sort of thing. And that has a significant change. We've already seen Montreal and Halifax are dominated by new housing starts that are speculator-led, and you look at the buildings at night and no lights are on. And so that's a concern. But it's also that, housing is being taken up for temporary or occasional use. So my grandfather on the British side had a flat on Park Avenue in New York because he regularly had to travel to Europe for business. And of course, that was cheaper and easier and more prestigious and more fun than just staying at a hotel. So I think that's the kind of phenomenon we're going to see a lot more, that there's going to be a different temporality of movement. And that will express itself in particular ways in terms of housing demand and expectations.
Well, I'm going to move us along. So I'm going to jump forward in our list of questions. Susie, is that okay? I'm going to jump to mine.
Sure.
All right, good. So
go for it.
So let's shift from the suburbs back to the core again. So up until recently, the city's policy on intensification has really been to direct growth to corridors and to nodes that are well served by public transportation. But under this new transect model, it appears that all points in space within the Greenbelt are up for grabs, with the exception of some pre-World War II neighborhoods that are covered by heritage overlays. Is the city actively campaigning to rid itself of single-family houses and R1 zoning? And if so, is it fair to say that neighborhoods, especially inner neighborhoods, are under attack?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's both barrels loaded for sure. I wouldn't suggest that the city has a conscious policy of trying to eliminate R1. We are well aware, of course, of the discussions that are happening predominantly in the United States, where R1 zoning has it's I don't want to say easier discussion. There are, very clear racial implications to single detached zoning that make the discussion clearer to more people as to why it is shifting. In Canada, we have not, despite the relatively obvious racist history of R1 zoning in Canada, where we're not saints. It is still harder for Canadians to understand why R1 zoning may not be as sustainable. What I think we will see is that in our new official plan, there is this notion in the general urban area in our more developed transects, the transects that are closest to the geographic core of the city. There will be high-level language in the official plan that speaks to the intensification of those, agnostic of the current zoning. But in the next term of council, we will have to go through the process of actually updating our comprehensive zoning bylaw in order to ensure that it meets with the official plan, which it really has not for decades. The thinking on intensification has simply become more and more aggressive without really any changes to most of our zoning in the city. Again, I think it's going to be up to voters to a certain extent to determine whether or not they're going to support politicians who want to question R1 zoning. It may end up being neighborhoods. Yeah, it may end up being a question that the province ultimately has to settle. Because as a city councillor, I'm very, very close to the voters, and I take seriously the requirement to represent the voters. And the
provincial policy says change, and you are representing people who say please don't change. Yep, so you're caught between a rock and a hard place.
Exactly, it is. It's a difficult spot to be in. What I would suggest is that the intensification that will happen in the closer transects to downtown will not see the R1 neighborhoods go to the more intense R4 and the R5. It's not going to be one size fits all. We recently undertook a study of the infill rules in Westboro. Westboro is predominantly single detached housing on relatively large lots. To your point, Benjamin, it significantly more sprawly than the new Barhaven. And we've gone through and we've created zoning that normalizes the pattern of creating semi-detached houses. We have not gone to the low-rise apartment buildings that I think Nick would suggest are probably the gentle density that we need much more of. We haven't gone to that extent, but we have enabled greater intensification in the Westboro R3 than we had previously. The R1 will probably be similarly incremental in terms of where it goes, just in order to maintain voter support.
Thanks, Jeff. There's a couple of good questions that have come through in the question and answer, so I'll read those out, and feel free, whomever they resonate with, to address them. So we have one a little bit from an anonymous member of the audience that says, I'm interested in the geographical differences between Canadian climate versus the climate regions in which newcomers immigrate from. How does this affect, if at all, the planning of intensification and the idea of a 15-minute neighborhood when infrastructure such as the Rideau Canal or the NCC cross-country ski networks aren't necessarily utilized by the minority populations? And then we have a question from Christopher. In an age where one's future ability to retire may depend upon our access to freehold property and its use as an economic nest egg, where in a future of dense urban dwelling, which is increasingly characterized by rent-driven housing, can this function be translated? And then I'll do one more, and then I see another one's come in, but maybe I'll stop there and we'll cluster the others after, give you some space.
I'm going to say very quickly, and that last point, because it's a question that's dear to my heart. The very controversial thing, and I'm going to try not to sound like a stale old Marxian here, but we have to decouple. We have to decouple territory. We have to decouple housing from property. The problem we have in housing affordability in Canada is that we have made land into a commodity, and urban service land is the problem. That's the driver of housing affordability. What we need to do is move to more emphyteutic leases, more aggressive sorts of ways in which we can change the way that land value is held and appreciates, which is, I think, a very good thing for the people who happen to be the owners, but tends to have very negative impacts. So that's the kind of thing that I would suspect, especially because I do a lot of work in Sweden, where we don't have the same kind of paramountcy principle, where the central government, where provincial and federal government can say something and lower levels of government have to follow suit. We could accomplish that. It would be much harder in Sweden, where subsidiarity, where local governments have enormous power to the point that agricultural land can't be protected by central government, etc. So that's my quick, familiar old tune, but I think it's becoming more and more acutely obvious that it's a problem.
I agree with them completely. Jeff, good luck. You know, I am one of those homeowners, so I have personally mixed feelings, but Nick is completely right. We have financialized property, and the only way to solve the affordability problem is to really break that link. In terms of minority access to recreational amenities and other amenities, given the persistent earnings gap that we find for minorities in at least Toronto and in other cities in Canada, this is a huge issue, because the neighborhoods which have the best transit, the best recreational amenities, the best sewer systems, every kind of infrastructure, are very expensive neighborhoods. So as long as there is an income gap between racialized newcomers and the rest and the Canadian born, that's going to be a very difficult link to break as well. And I don't know if that answers the person's question, but I would argue, just as Jeff has for property, we have to figure out why racialized newcomers and their children are not doing as well economically as they should be based on their education, their qualifications, and their experience. And we need to fix it. And that is not an issue necessarily for municipal government.
It's a real problem in Ottawa with respect to the neighborhoods that are probably best placed to serve lower income earning racialized persons are completely unaffordable. And the improvements that make these great neighborhoods become unattainable to the people who would benefit most. So one of the key drivers in Kitchissippi Ward to gentrification and intensification has been light rail. And light rail is it's a game changer with respect to how you get around the city. Unfortunately, as light rail has come through, it has been the handmaiden of gentrification, so that you can plot the displacement by where the LRT is going next, and that is a difficult problem as a city to try to solve with the tools that we have. But it's a critically important one. There is, I want to be careful because I know this is being recorded, but it is difficult to fathom building these amenities, the recreation spaces, the LRT, et cetera, for groups of people who are the least in need of them, right? So I will leave it there before I get myself into too much trouble.
Jeff, can I just make a comment? And
Of course,
every
please.
transportation planner in the audience, whoever watches this, is going to just want to throw daggers at me. I think what we need is some kind of agreement that for every dollar we spend that benefits a neighborhood that is more affluent, we will spend $2, $5, $10 on the same service in neighborhoods which have lower income. And it's only with, you know, this is akin to Nick pointing out that you can't own property, you know, but it's only that kind of huge commitment that is ever going to undo that link between improvements and who benefits from them.
I think there's a role as well for municipal governments to ensure that we are making the investment in community housing, either with our partners or directly through our own agencies, to build that housing in transit-rich neighborhoods. So I you know, as long as property is a market commodity, I despair that we will have housing of the type in the ward that serves those who can best benefit from the new amenities, unless we build it ourselves. And I think that you know, that speaks to very much to the need for investments that municipalities can't make. We don't have a property base, tax base that will allow us to build the amount of housing that we need. It speaks very much to the kind of federal commitments and provincial commitments that we've been seeing, particularly over the last several weeks.
I'm going to jump in with one more radical point, which I believe strongly in, which is the reorganization of the redistribution or the distribution of power in Canada. And for me, one of them is that local municipalities need a more stable and more robust source of revenue. And one of the things that I believe firmly in is local income tax. I lived in a city in Switzerland, in Basel, which was a half canton. So it was a city-state. And they had income tax powers, which meant that if you wanted to take advantage of the income taxes you were paying, you were probably going to live in the same jurisdiction. You know, the fact that we make our municipalities rely on property tax revenues and then transfer payments is one of the things that actually, in my view, means that municipalities in Canada are in the business of gentrification. Their only priority, if they want to sustain themselves, is to at least keep property values stable, if not increase them. That, I mean, that's a radical point, because that's a pretty significant ask of the higher levels of government.
Well, I think, Susie, I think we're going to wrap up, because the idea here is to always keep people wanting more. This is the beginning, a conversation that we're hoping to continue in various forms throughout this whole lecture series. You can probably tell this is exactly the kind of conversation I want to have, which is how do we get people together to talk about smart people together to talk about the future of our communities and the shape of our cities and the transformation of the country. So, Susie, over to you to finish this up.
Sure, just a quick note. So thank you so very much to all of our speakers. Really fantastic discussion. And as Ben says, I hope that we can continue these conversations moving forward. We want to remind everyone that this is just the first in our forum lecture series for the year. Our next one will be Walter Hood speaking about public space reassembly on Tuesday, October 19th. That'll also be online at 6 p.m. And we'll have the full lineup available on our school's website in the coming days, including the registration links. And so please feel free to check that out for further information. Thank you so very much to our speakers, to the audience for attending this event on our